Imagine this scenario. It's the frigid spring of 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic is absolutely raging, and you're a German U-boat radio operator. You're deep below the waves, headphones clamped on, and you're just swimming in pure, raw intelligence. Clear as day, through the static you pick up Allied signals, British destroyers coordinating their search patterns, maybe American supply convoys broadcasting their exact positions, even faint distress calls from ships they've just torpedoed. All the information you'd ever need to hunt effectively. It's right there, being broadcast loud and clear.
But here's the kicker. The central, really bitter irony that decided everything at sea. Those U-boat crews couldn't understand a single word of it. Those signals, clear as they were locked down by encryption machines so far beyond what the Germans could crack, it might as well have been, well, just random noise. Gibberish.
And the twist. It gets even worse. While those U-boats were essentially sailing deaf and blind thousands of miles away in England, Allied codebreakers, the folks at Bletchley Park, they were reading the German U-boat captain's most secret orders. Sometimes before the captain himself even got them. Think about that. We knew their targets, their fuel levels, their planned movements, and critically, when they had to surface, the hunters became the hunted, completely exposed.
Exactly. And that incredible information imbalance, that asymmetry, that's what we're diving deep into today. We're exploring this Cipher war beneath the waves, the hidden battle that truly decided the Battle of the Atlantic. And we're going to focus on, really, 5 critical failures: intelligence, technology, organization that cost Germany its early edge and led to, frankly, the catastrophic loss of its U-boat fleet.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this.
Yeah.
First off, we need to appreciate that the German U-boat communications setup wasn't, primitive. Is actually highly sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
Central to how they fought.
Oh, absolutely. Far from primitive. Admiral Karl Donitz, he ran the most lethal submarine campaign in history. We're talking over 3,000 Allied ships sunk between 39 and 45. And to pull that off, he relied heavily on his Wolfpack tactic. Multiple U-boats spread out, sometimes over vast distances, but constantly coordinated by radio from headquarters. They needed that radio link to converge on convoys together.
And that coordination, that means constant radio use.
Yeah.
But the Germans knew, didn't they, the massive risk every single time a U-boat keyed its transmitter. Any long broadcast was like sending up a flare.
They were acutely aware. A long transmission basically screamed, "Here I am," to Allied direction-finding stations. It made them instantly vulnerable. And that fear, that risk, it drove some really crucial innovations on their side. They developed the crypt signal system, the short signal codes.
Short signals.
Yeah.
So making the transmissions as brief as possible.
Precisely. The challenge was immense. How do you condense a whole detailed report, say, a convoy sighting, grid coordinates, weather conditions, into a message that lasts maybe 20 seconds? They did it using these huge code books. Operators would look up pre-assigned number or letter groups for common phrases, locations, things like that. Then they'd type that pre-coded message into the Enigma machine and transmit it using high-speed Morse code super fast.
So, not just short, but compressed language sent at breakneck speed. A real race against the clock for Allied direction finders. And later in the war, they took it even further, didn't they, with the courier system, though that came pretty late.
It did, 1944. But courier was technically brilliant. It used a sort of high-speed magnetic tape recorder to pre-record the encrypted message, then it blasted the whole thing out in a burst lasting less than half a second. That was genuinely too fast for most Allied direction-finding gear at the time to get an accurate fix.
Which, as you said, makes the timing almost tragic for them. A fantastic technical solution that arrived way too late to change the strategic picture in the Atlantic. Okay, so while the U-boats were desperately trying to hide their own signals, they were also listening intently, weren't they? They weren't just transmitting blind.
Oh, absolutely. They had good radio direction-finding gear on board themselves, and they were constantly monitoring Allied frequencies, especially distress channels and those sometimes quite lengthy procedural messages the British anti-submarine escorts used. If you had a couple U-boats listening, they could exchange bearings and triangulate an enemy ship's position with reasonable accuracy.
And we really have to give credit where it's due, initially at least. The German Navy's own code-breaking service, the B-Dienst. They were remarkably good early on. They had some staggering successes that often get lost in the Enigma story.
They were absolutely top tier in the 1930s, no question. By 1935, well before the war really kicked off, B-Dienst had already broken the main British naval code. Think about that. When war started in 1939, the Germans already knew the location and likely roles of basically every major British warship. That's a huge head start. They also cracked the Allied merchant ships code, BAMS, which was another massive intelligence win, giving them insight into convoy movements.
And their absolute peak, the time they really dominated, that was February 1942, when they broke the code for the high-level Atlantic convoy communications. That must have been devastating for the Allies.
It was catastrophic, utterly catastrophic. From roughly December 1942 through May 1943, that period B-Dienst could read something like 80% of the intercepted Allied convoy messages. 80%. That intelligence let Dönitz vector his wolf packs right onto the convoy routes. It led directly to those enormous shipping losses that genuinely threatened to starve Britain out of the war.
So here's the million-dollar question then. If they were that good, reading 80% of the traffic, why did it all fall apart? You mentioned timeliness earlier. Was that the first crack, even when they were at their best?
Yes, that's the first absolutely fatal operational flaw. Even during that peak period, reading 80% of the messages, get this, only about 10% of those decoded messages were actually processed, translated, analyzed, and passed along to the U-boats in the field in time to be useful. The whole process was just too slow. Decryption was still very manual, very laborious. By the time Dönitz got the analyzed intel and radioed new orders out, the convoy they were targeting was often long gone. That window of opportunity just slammed shut. So this reliance on slow, manual code breaking meant their success was always brittle, always fragile, even before the Allies really got their own systems perfected.
Right, that makes sense. It was just about reading the mail. It was about reading it fast enough to act on it.
Yeah.
And that sets us up perfectly for part two, doesn't it? The deeper systemic problems within the German intelligence structure itself. It wasn't just slow. It was fundamentally broken.
Fundamentally broken is a good way to put it. It was, frankly, a bureaucratic and political mess. Germany didn't have one central code-breaking agency. Instead, you had multiple competing services all trying to do similar things. There was the OKWII for the Overall Armed Forces Command, then separate, often quite hostile departments for the Army, the Air Force, and of course the Navy's B-Dienst. And then you also had the Abwehr, the Military Intelligence Service, and even the SS ran its own little cryptographic unit. It was incredibly fragmented.
Wow, that sounds less like a unified war effort and more like, I don't know, rival companies fighting over market share instead of focusing on the enemy.
That's a very good analogy. And the central, absolutely fatal flaw in that structure, none of them shared information effectively. There was no real mechanism, no culture of collaboration. Each branch jealously guarded its own secrets, its own breakthroughs. They worried that sharing would somehow diminish their own importance, their funding, their political clout. So they duplicated effort constantly, wasted incredible amounts of mathematical talent trying to solve problems another German agency might have already cracked, and they just couldn't build up that systemic shared knowledge base.
So, no German Bletchley Park. No single place where the nation's best minds, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, were all pooled together, focused on cracking the enemy's codes. Which means that even when B-Dienst had those amazing early successes with British naval codes, that intelligence probably stayed locked within the Navy, right? The Air Force couldn't use it to coordinate attacks better, for example.
Precisely. And that fragmentation led to huge strategic blind spots. Take April 1942, for instance. The U.S. Navy completely changed its main operational code systems. Overnight, a major source of intelligence for the Germans, the traffic they relied on to track transatlantic shipping, just vanished, went dark. Now, if Germany had had a centralized intelligence command, that massive loss would have triggered alarm bells at the highest level. It would have demanded a huge coordinated effort to figure out the new American systems. But because things were so fragmented, it was just seen as, well, another problem for the Navy's B-Dienst to handle on its own, with its limited resources.
Meanwhile, as you said, the British were bringing in Typex and other much tougher encryption systems. So by 1943, the German codebreakers are effectively flying blind. And yet those poor U-boat operators are still down there, hearing those Allied signals crystal clear coordination chatter. But now it's completely meaningless noise, a constant, frustrating reminder of the intelligence they just couldn't access.
And what's truly fascinating, almost perverse, is that the biggest barrier preventing the Germans from realizing their own vulnerability wasn't technical. It was psychological. It was this ingrained logic trap, this extreme overconfidence. The thinking went something like this. Our Enigma machine is mathematically perfect. Our best minds designed it. It's unbreakable. Therefore, since Allied machines like Typex seem to be based on similar rotor principles, their machines must be even more complex and even more unbreakable.
Wow. That's confirmation bias on a grand military scale.
Yeah.
So their own inability to break Allied codes actually reinforced their belief that their own system was safe. That's twisted logic.
It's exactly that destructive loop. There's a famous captured German document that lays it out almost explicitly. It says their ongoing failure to penetrate Allied high-grade ciphers only served to strengthen their conviction in Enigma's own impregnability. They weren't looking at the operational reality, the sinking U-boats, the convoys getting through unscathed, and asking, could our codes be compromised? Instead, they looked inward and essentially congratulated themselves on how secure Enigma must be because they couldn't break the Allied equivalent.
So this deep-seated belief meant they never really committed the resources or the brain power to seriously attacking Allied codes, did they? Not in the way the Allies were throwing everything at Enigma. They saw the difficulty of their task as proof of the enemy's advanced technology, which paradoxically made them feel secure about their own supposedly superior machine.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing it as a massive warning sign that the enemy might already be reading their communication.
Exactly. Which brings us perfectly to part 3, looking at the actual cipher fortress the Allies built, starting with the British Typex machine.
Ah yes, Typex. The ultimate irony, really, because it was developed directly from commercial Enigma patents that the British got hold of before the war. They basically looked at how Enigma worked and said, okay, how can we make this much, much better?
And the improvements were substantial. They addressed fundamental weaknesses that the German designers, in their confidence, either overlooked or dismissed. For example, while the standard German Navy Enigma, the M4, used 4 rotors later in the war, Typex typically used 5 rotors. Some versions even had 6. But critically, the British added a clever mechanism where the first 2 rotors in the stack could be set to remain stationary during daily operations.
Stationary rotors. That sounds minor, but I'm guessing it has huge implications for security. How does that make it harder to break?
It changes the game completely for the codebreaker. Remember, the bomb machine the Allies used against Enigma worked by rapidly testing possible rotor movements and how they stepped. By keeping the first 2 Typex rotors fixed, they essentially acted like complex, customized internal wiring that didn't change day to day. For the Typex operator, this simplified things, but for anyone trying to break the code, it exponentially increased the number of possible internal wiring combinations they'd have to test. Those 2 static rotors added layers of complexity that made the brute force mathematical attacks used against Enigma basically impossible with 1940s tech.
Clever. And they built in other improvements too, didn't they? Physical things, operational security.
They did. Things like doubled electrical contacts inside the rotors for better reliability. Enigma could sometimes miss in Cipher due to dirty contacts. And some Typex rotors were designed in 2 parts, these things called slugs, which could be inserted in different ways. This wasn't just about complexity, it was an anti-tamper feature. Even if you captured a Typex machine, you still had to figure out the internal orientation of these slugs for each rotor, which created just astronomical numbers of combinations, way beyond what German analysts could figure out quickly.
And operationally, they integrated Typex directly with teleprinters, which sounds like a huge advantage over Enigma's light bulbs.
Massive advantage. That integration solved 2 huge problems the Germans constantly struggled with. First, the encrypted message was automatically printed out on paper tape. This completely eliminated the most common source of errors in the German system, simple human mistakes when writing down the ciphertext letters from the Enigma lampboard. Second, it meant Typex only needed 1 operator, not 2 like Enigma often required. 1 to type, 1 to write. This made it faster to use and less prone to procedural errors. All this operational discipline meant the Allies maintained a cleaner ciphertext, free from those little human errors or shortcuts that sometimes gave codebreakers away in the cribs.
Okay, so that's the British layer. And then the Americans had their own machine, the ECM Mark II, which was even more complex.
Yes, the Electric Cipher Machine Mark II, sometimes called SIGIBA by the Army. It was built on different principles, not directly related to Enigma, and was considered extremely secure. And initially, the U.S. Navy guarded it very closely. They actually refused to share it with the British until 1943. But eventually, the need for seamless communication across the Allied forces became obvious, so they developed what was called the Combined Cipher Machine System, or CCM. This essentially allowed British Typex and American ECM machines to talk to each other securely.
And the investment in this? I read the CCM program alone cost something like $6 million back then. That's a fortune.
It was an enormous sum, equivalent to building several destroyers, maybe? It just shows you the level of priority the Allies placed on secure communications and cryptology. They saw it as a fundamental weapon system, worth investing huge resources in.
You contrast that with the fragmented, under-resourced German efforts. It's night and day. So back in the U-boat, the German radio operator intercepts these Allied signals encoded by Typex or ECM Mark II. What are they actually hearing?
They're hearing essentially a perfect stream of random letters, mathematically pure randomness. There are no discernible patterns, no repetitions, no statistical quirks that 1940s analytical techniques could possibly latch onto. Without having the physical machine in front of you, knowing exactly how its rotors and plugs are set for that specific day, breaking those Allied ciphers was, for all practical purposes, mathematically impossible for the Germans.
Which brings us crashing into part 4, the deepest, most staggering irony of this whole story. While the Germans banged their heads against the unbreakable Allied cipher wall, their own supposedly perfect Enigma machine, for the Allies, it was practically an open book for much of the war.
It truly is one of the great defining ironies of the conflict. And the story of cracking Enigma, crucially, it doesn't start at Bletchley Park. It starts in Poland, years before the war.
Right, the Polish Cipher Bureau. The foundational work, the real breakthrough, came from them. Marian Rejewski, a Polish mathematician, he was the first one to crack Enigma's secrets, wasn't he? Back in December 1932.
December 1932. 7 years before the invasion of Poland. Rejewski's genius was using pure mathematics specifically, analyzing patterns in how letters repeated or cycled in the ciphertext to figure out the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors and the reflector. He did this without ever seeing the machine's blueprints, just by studying the encrypted messages. It was an incredible intellectual feat. Then in July 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded, the Poles made the courageous decision to share everything they knew, their methods, their findings, and even 2 replica Enigma machines they had built with British and French intelligence at a secret meeting near Warsaw. That gift was priceless. It gave the Allies the crucial head start.
So Bletchley Park didn't have to start from zero. They inherited this incredible foundation for the Poles. And then people like Alan Turing and Gordon Welshman took that mathematical understanding and turned it into an industrial-scale decryption process with the bomb machine.
Exactly. The bomb wasn't really a computer as we think of it today. It was this big, clanking electromechanical device, maybe the size of a couple of large wardrobes. Its job was to automate the incredibly tedious process of testing thousands upon thousands of possible Enigma settings, rotor orders, starting positions, plug board connections, against a piece of intercepted ciphertext where the codebreakers had a good guess about the underlying plaintext. That guess was called a crib.
Can you explain that crib idea a bit more? Because that seems absolutely vital to how the bombs work.
Oh, it was essential. A crib was basically a known or strongly suspected piece of the original German message before it was encrypted. For instance, the Germans were creatures of habit. Weather ships often sent reports at the exact same time each day, maybe starting with a standard phrase like Wetterbericht für Nordatlantik, weather report for North Atlantic, or ending predictably with Heil Hitler. If the Bletchley Codebreakers had an intercepted message and they suspected it contained Wetterbericht, they could program the bomb to rapidly cycle through all the possible Enigma settings, looking for one that would turn the known plaintext Wetterbericht into the specific jumble of ciphertext letters they had actually intercepted at that point in the message.
Okay, so the bomb wasn't just blindly trying every possible key. It was using these likely bits of text, these cribs, to dramatically narrow down the possibilities and find the correct daily settings much faster.
Precisely. It was essentially using logic and suspected plaintext to find the key rather than pure mathematical brute force against the entire key space. And the real turning point, the moment this capability decisively shifted the Battle of the Atlantic, came in May 1941. There were 2 key captures then. First, the German weather ship München, and then even more importantly, the U-boat U-110. These captures yielded not just code books, but crucially intact Enigma machines, including the extra rotors used by the Navy. Suddenly, Bletchley Park had the physical hardware, the current code settings, and the mathematical methods. They could start reading German naval traffic, often within hours of transmission.
And the impact must have been immediate and dramatic. The submarine tracking room in London, armed with this ultra-intelligence, they could suddenly see the U-boats on their map almost in real time.
Almost. They could plot the reported position of nearly every U-boat operating in the Atlantic, predict where they were heading based on their orders, and crucially route the vulnerable Allied convoys around the waiting wolf packs. It transformed the battle from a desperate, often blind struggle into something more like a managed hunt, where the Allies could steer their sheep away from the wolves they knew were lurking. But that incredible advantage wasn't permanent, at least not initially. Dönitz, suspecting something was wrong, though not Enigma compromise, introduced a more complex 4-rotor Enigma machine, the M4, or Triton, specifically for U-boat communications in February 1942. This caused a major crisis at Bletchley Park. Their existing three-rotor bombs couldn't handle the complexity of the fourth rotor. It resulted in a roughly 10-month blackout where they couldn't reliably read U-boat traffic.
And during that 10-month blackout,
Right.
that's when Allied shipping losses went through the roof again, wasn't it? Over 5.6 million tons sunk just between February and the end of 1942. It really shows how vital that ultra-intelligence was.
It starkly demonstrates that intelligence was the decisive factor. The ships, the planes, the tactics were all important, but without knowing where the U-boats were, the losses were horrific. The fate of the battle really hung on breaking that four-rotor Enigma. And the breakthrough, when it came, was incredibly dramatic and costly. In October 1942, British destroyers cornered U-559 in the Mediterranean and forced it to surface. As the German crew scrambled off, two British sailors, Lieutenant Anthony Fasten and able seaman Colin Grazier, along with a canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, climbed aboard the sinking sub.
Knowing it could go down any second, that takes incredible courage.
Absolutely heroic. They managed to grab vital code books, including the short signal books, and crucially the setting sheets for the new four-rotor Enigma, passing them up to Brown just before the U-boat suddenly sank, taking Fasten and Grazier down with it.
They gave their lives. But those documents were the key Bletchley needed, weren't they? The final piece of the puzzle for the M4 Enigma.
They were. Those documents gave Turing and his team the insights needed to adapt the bombs and understand the wiring of the fourth rotor. By December 1942, Allied cryptanalysts were reading U-boat traffic again, almost as quickly as before. And from that point on, really from early 1943 onwards, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively and permanently against Germany. The U-boats went from being the hunters to being relentlessly hunted down.
Yet, as you mentioned earlier, Admiral Dunitz, even as his U-boat fleet was being systematically decimated, he just refused to believe Enigma could be compromised.
Yeah.
He saw the Allied successes, the uncanny accuracy of their attacks, but he explained it all away.
He remained in complete denial right up until his deathbed, apparently. He insisted the Allies couldn't possibly be reading his signals. He attributed the devastating losses entirely to other factors: new Allied radar, particularly airborne radar, improved sonar, ASTIC, more effective depth charges, long-range patrol aircraft like the Liberator closing the Mid-Atlantic Gap. All those things were factors, of course, but they were made exponentially more effective by ultra-intelligence telling them exactly where to look.
That level of intellectual blindness, when the evidence was literally sinking his fleet, it's hard to comprehend. How could he ignore the fact that Allied convoys were somehow magically avoiding his perfectly positioned wolf packs time after time?
It seems to be a classic case of refusing to question a core belief. The belief in Enigma's perfection was so ingrained in the German military psyche, particularly within the Navy, that acknowledging it was compromised was unthinkable. It would have meant admitting a catastrophic failure at the heart of their command structure, so they found other explanations, however inadequate.
And the human cost of that denial was just horrific for the U-boat crews. You mentioned the scale of the Allied effort, thousands working at Bletchley, many of them young women from services like the Wrens or the U.S. Navy Waves, routinely decrypting these unbreakable messages.
Yes, the process became highly industrialized. One former Wren described the almost mundane routine of processing the intercepts day after day and the chilling realization that they knew exactly where these men were, often sealing their fate. By the end of the war, something like 700 U-boats were lost. That's roughly 75% of all that were deployed operationally. And with them, around 30,000 experienced submariners died. A huge number of those deaths were a direct result of Allied forces knowing exactly where to find them, thanks to cracking Enigma.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together now, synthesizing everything we've discussed, the story of why German Cipher efforts failed while their own codes were broken seems to boil down to 5 really critical factors. Can we quickly recap those?
Absolutely. Number 1, organizational fragmentation. We talked about this. The German intelligence effort was disastrously scattered across rival agencies: Navy, Army, Air Force, OKW, Abwehr, SS, none of them cooperating. The Allies, in stark contrast, centralized their best minds and resources, primarily at Bletchley Park in the UK, and related efforts in Washington. It was a unified, industrial-scale approach versus fragmented fiefdoms.
Right. Factor number 2, overconfidence and confirmation bias. The unwavering belief in Enigma's mathematical perfection. This blinded the German high command to mounting evidence of compromise. They consistently explained away U-boat losses with other factors, reinforcing their false sense of security instead of investigating their own communications. This hubris was fatal.
Third, massive disparity in resource allocation. Germany simply never invested in cryptanalysis breaking enemy codes on anything like the Allied scale. Bletchley Park alone had over 7,000 personnel at its peak, solely dedicated to signals intelligence. The U.S. poured millions into the technology, like the CCM program. Germany treated code breaking as important, but not as the potentially war-winning weapon the Allies rightly saw it as.
Factor 4, and this really highlights Allied cleverness. Superior operational security regarding their own intelligence coup, Ultra. The Allies were incredibly careful about how they used the information gleaned from Enigma. They never acted on ultra-intelligence unless there was a plausible cover story, a sighting by a patrol plane, a lucky radar contact, HFDF bearings. They maintained the fiction that Enigma was secure, sometimes for years after they'd broken it. They even used deception, like gardening mining areas they knew U-boats would report on, just to generate reliable cribs.
Exactly. And finally, factor number 5. Technically superior Allied cipher machines. While Enigma was brilliant for its time, Typex and the American ECM Mark II were genuinely more advanced. They incorporated design improvements, more rotors, stationary rotors, better internal wiring complexity, integration with teleprinters that specifically counter the types of mathematical and procedural attacks that had proven successful against Enigma. Combined with stricter Allied operational procedures, their high-level ciphers remained truly secure throughout the war.
So the overwhelming takeaway seems to be that the codebreakers, the mathematicians and linguists at Bletchley and elsewhere arguably did more to win the Battle of the Atlantic than any single weapon system. That hidden intelligence advantage was truly the decisive element.
I think that's fair to say. The German U-boat crews were incredibly skilled, brave, and had sophisticated technology for their time, but they lost. They lost because they were fighting blind, while their enemy had near-perfect situational awareness. By the war's end, as we said, 30,000 submariners lost their lives, many because Dönitz couldn't accept his codes were broken, and the Allies knew exactly where to send the destroyers and the aircraft.
So let's bring this home. What does this incredible, terrifying story of code breaking, overconfidence, and information asymmetry mean for you listening today? This isn't just history. The lessons are profoundly relevant right now.
They absolutely are. Think about intelligence, security, and decision-making in any complex organization today, whether it's a military, a government agency, or a large corporation. The German failure highlights two timeless human vulnerabilities: bureaucratic infighting, that fragmentation we discussed, and secondly, denial driven by overconfidence.
That fragmentation failure. You see it all the time in modern organizations, don't you? Silos. Different departments, different teams, maybe IT security versus product development, hoarding information, not collaborating. They get more concerned about protecting their internal turf or budget than addressing the external threat, creating dangerous blind spots, just like the German intelligence agencies did.
Precisely. And the denial. Admiral Dönitz refusing to believe his perfect Enigma could be flawed. That's the exact same confirmation bias that stops organizations today from properly investigating potential security breaches or investing in fixing known vulnerabilities. It's the "it can't happen to us" mindset. You have to constantly, rigorously question the security of your own systems, your own assumptions, because the moment you assume you're invulnerable, history suggests your adversary might already be reading your secrets.
A chilling thought. Maybe something for you to consider the next time someone assures you that their network, their encryption, their communication channel is absolutely, positively foolproof. The battle for information security, for secrecy, it's never truly over. And as the story of the U-boats shows, sometimes the most dangerous vulnerability isn't in the technology itself, but in the misplaced certainty of the people who operate it.